This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.
Hey everyone, it's Mark Bayer, and you are tuned to When Science Speaks. This episode of the show is sponsored by OneSkin. Led by PhD scientists dedicated to helping people age in a healthy, vibrant way, OneSkin patented the first protein building block scientifically proven to reverse skin aging at the molecular level. Listeners of When Science Speaks receive a special 15% discount off an entire OneSkin order. That's any products, no minimum purchase. Just go to oneskin.co and use the promo code SCIENCE15 at checkout. That is the word science with the number 15 next to it. Checkout to get your discount. And we'll also have a link in the show notes that accompany this episode. It is so great to have Matt Kaplan on the show today. For 2 decades, Matt hosted Planetary Radio, the Planetary Society's renowned weekly space podcast and radio program, bringing more than 1,000 episodes and more than 2,000 space exploration leaders to an eager global audience while shepherding the show to its position in the top 0.5% of all podcasts. Matt's been on stages around the world to present Planetary Radio live and visited many of our planet's most important and inspiring sites where space science and exploration are advanced. Matt has a background in journalism that's ranged from public radio reporter covering the political conventions to movie reviewer for an international magazine, getting his first job in broadcasting at the tender age of 17. Matt has been a Planetary Society staff member for more than 22 years. He continues to serve as moderator or speaker at space and science gatherings on behalf of the Society, and we're going to talk about one that's upcoming in just a few moments. Matt also is a proud recipient of the Mars Horizon Award from Explore Mars. He also enjoyed a 30-year career in higher education that included major television awards and recognition for service to the community. The San Diego, California resident has 2 adult daughters raised to be citizens of the solar system. Welcome to the show, Matt. Wonderful to have you here.
Thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here, and what a great bio. Thank you.
People say that. It's you. I didn't fabricate anything. Matt, I'm so excited to talk to you. I know listeners are really fired up to hear what you have to say. And as I mentioned, you've recently stepped away from the mic after 2 decades and 1,000 episodes and just reaching so many people with such important, inspiring information. So first, congratulations on your inspiring body of work with Planet Radio.
Thank you very much. It truly is, outside of family, probably the thing I am most proud of having achieved in my life. And I'm also thrilled to know that it's in good hands. I know we'll talk about that a little bit later, but just selfishly, it helped me realize a lot of dreams and let me talk to a lot of heroes.
Just wonderful. And with Planet Radio, you combine your twin professional passions, which are radio and space. And so I want to start by asking you, from a journalism perspective, about your approach to presenting what's often complicated information to the public, abstract, hard to visualize, and how you make that fascinating and accessible. Do you have certain go-to general communication principles or tools that you found particularly effective?
Have I learned a lot over the years? Oh, yeah, I can barely listen to the stuff that I did in college many decades ago. And I've always loved talking about science. I've always loved learning and reading about science. So to me, there's such fascination in it anyway that a lot of it is getting out of the way. There was a great TV host for many years in Los Angeles named Ralph Story. And he was a hero to at least one other buddy of mine at the college radio station and I. His interviews just seemed so effortless, so down to earth, so human, and he brought out the best in people. He came to campus once to host a show, and we interviewed him afterward, and we said, "What's your secret? You're so good at this." He said, 2 things. I always do my homework, which means you study up. It's a heck of a lot easier now with the infinite internet behind us to learn more about your guest and their work than it used to be in the old days. It was really a challenge. But the other thing he said was learning how to listen. And that is still a challenge for me because I like to talk, as you can probably tell. And so learning to pay attention, laying out how you think an interview might go, but because you're listening, being prepared to go in an entirely new direction because something catches your interest and probably will catch the interest of your audience. That's a big part of it. It has been remarkably easy to talk to most of those 2,000 or so scientists and engineers and astronauts and administrators because most of them are true believers in the dream. They believe in science, they believe in space exploration, and they just need it to come out. So, asking them the right questions. If you have an author, you probably have discovered if you bring in an author and you start asking questions that immediately indicate that you actually read the book, they're blown away because some of them, the more famous ones, have probably been on tour. They're used to just being asked the standard questions that are handed out in the media packet that got there a couple of days before the interview was done. That's another great thing, really letting people know that you appreciate their work, that you share their fascination for it, and in that case, that you've read their book, or at least that you tell them that you are in the middle of it if you haven't had time to finish it. That's just some of it, but a lot of it is trying to stay out of the way, which I'm not doing right now. I'm taking advantage of being on the other side of the mic.
No, you're giving us so many important things here. And actually, implicit in something that you said is your passion and your
Mm.
energy for the topic. And that really makes such a huge difference for listeners. Sometimes I say, like, give energy, get engagement. Like, it's so clear that you're passionate about this. It's like almost impossible for a listener not to get excited and engaged because you are.
I hope you're right about that. I've often said, only half jokingly, that I do this stuff because it lets me meet and have these conversations with these people that I consider heroes. And so it's really very selfish. I ask them the questions that I want to ask them, that I would ask them if we were sitting in a restaurant or on a park bench someplace. For the most part, there are things that I may already know the answer to, but I know that the audience, a significant portion of them, are going to be wondering about that. And there are ways to make sure that comes up as well.
Exactly. Yeah. It leads to my next question, which is, what do you see as elements of a good question? Clearly, you mentioned
Mm.
preparation. If you're informed about the book or the background of the guest that you're talking to, then that helps you actually dig a little deeper than just the general press junket questions that you mentioned. Are there any other elements that you really consider to be important when you're thinking about crafting a good question?
The internet has made this so much easier to find little nuggets that maybe have not been covered elsewhere. I'll follow YouTube links that might be mentioned either in someone else's interview, that somebody did a YouTube video, and I'll try to watch that YouTube video. Sometimes it's a TED Talk, sometimes it's a lot less formal than that. And there'll be some little gem there that you haven't heard anybody else pick up on. And when you bring that out, because you can tell that it's very close to their heart, that just makes such a huge difference. You may have experienced, I bet you have, going in to an interview with a guest. We'll talk about a non-author this time, who maybe really just is not sure why their public information officer is making them do this again. And they find out in the first few minutes, wow, this is somebody who, like you said, shares the passion and really has looked into my work. And even if they don't understand the work completely, they're asking good questions to help themselves and others understand it better. I think finding those little out of the way factoids that you suspect are important to people really brings out important parts of their story, but it also opens up most guests.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. And so many people don't do it. That's such a great asset to have when you're thinking
Yeah.
about talking to folks. And lots of people talk about the value of narrative and storytelling, and with good reason. They're both fundamentally important. I sometimes find that it doesn't go quite beyond that, meaning, what are the elements of a really engaging, interesting, stimulating story? How do you think about constructing and delivering compelling stories?
Beginning, middle, and end. It works for writers. It works for us too. People like to think in linear terms. They like to think in terms of stories. And so many of the stories that we have covered on Planetary Radio lend themselves to that. I think of talking to Alan Stern, one of my favorite guests, certainly. I call him the busiest man in space exploration because he seems like he's got a hand in almost every mission underway. He is also the principal investigator for the New Horizons mission, which revealed Pluto to us. My God, talk about an exciting occasion, and has gone on to show us the first much more distant objects up close out there in the outer solar system, in the Kuiper Belt. The story of New Horizons is so dramatic because there were so many points along the way in that narrative where it looked like that mission was going to come to an end before it ever got off the launch pad, quite literally. It's such a wonderful human story of drama, how he and this team stayed with it for decades, getting help, I might add, very self-servingly from the Planetary Society to make sure that this mission could move forward and do the amazing work that it did. And you look for those elements that talk about why did somebody want to, in this case, why send something out to Pluto? It's so difficult. And a lot of the difficulty is before you ever get off the launch pad, it's finding that money and the support from NASA and developing the instruments and making sure they all work together and that the thing is going to keep talking to you for decades on end over the course of that mission. It's so great to bring this stuff out and talk about how people have progressed to where they are now. You can do the same thing talking to somebody about the progression of our knowledge about a world like Mars, where people were convinced in the early 1900s that there were Martians out there just waiting for us to say hi and start a conversation, to the first missions to Mars, the early Mariner spacecraft in the 1960s that made it look like no more lively than the moon, to now, where we once again see this as a planet with a wonderful past where things may have very much been alive. Hopefully, we'll find out soon, but is still today a very dynamic, beautiful place. And my goodness, there is a wonderful story that is still being told.
Fascinating. You referenced, Matt, Planetary Society. It was your professional home, has been for decades. Love for you to talk about the Planetary Society, its programs, initiatives, what it's working on, contributions, all sorts of things like that.
I love this organization and I love the team. I've been there now for about 22 and a half years since I actually got started. I was a member. I saw that they were going to be putting on one of our Planet Fest activities and usually wrapped up around some big event having to do with a mission. And it was going to be happening at the Pasadena Convention Center and they needed volunteers. And I thought, hey, I've got some audiovisual and video background and I'll volunteer. They'll put me to work doing something. Within like a week, I was the head of audiovisual for that conference. And it was the first one we ever did a webcast from. And so we didn't know what we were doing. Nobody did in those days. We barely do now with this crazy streaming video stuff. And I got an offer from Lou Friedman, our executive director emeritus, still very much around, very much involved with doing great work, great research, to go part-time. And I was part-time at the Society for many years. This was back when we had a little green and green design craftsman home about a half block off of Colorado Boulevard, which people know as the route of the Rose Parade every New Year's Day. And it was a home and it was a family. It was a very small organization. Times changed. We accomplished a lot back in those days. Our three founders were very involved. Carl Sagan, your fellow Cornell, not alumnus, I guess he was a faculty member, the famous Bruce Murray, the former leader of the Jet Propulsion Lab, and Lou Friedman, who I already mentioned, who was the head of the Mars program at one time at JPL, got together, decided back in around 1980 that everybody loved space exploration, but there was nothing in the pipeline. Nothing was going on in terms of robotic exploration, or even in, for that matter, in human exploration. Space shuttle was still a ways off. And they started this organization, and Carl would go on the Johnny Carson show and talk about it. And before we knew it, we had tens of thousands of members. All organizations evolve. We went through some changes just in the nature of how organizations change and how we reach people. And what we have now is an entire new generation of staff. I'm so proud that I bridge these two generations. But it is an amazing team now. It's a much bigger team. It's not quite the sense of almost a real family that we had back in those days. It's still a family. Incredibly talented people who are united in their belief in our mission, which is, I'm reading it now, empowering the world's citizens to advance space science and exploration, and the vision to know our cosmos and our place within it. And everything flows out of that. And we have had a piece of many missions, either by letting the public share in them, by putting their name on a plaque or on a CD or a DVD, or by helping to shepherd those missions through Congress, by organizing members of Congress to actually formed a caucus for planetary science to help further it across all the members of Congress, working with the executive branch, working with scientists who make presentations before Congress is something that you know a lot about, far more than me. And then just sharing what Bill Nye likes to call the PB&J, the passion, beauty, and joy of space and science with everybody on Earth. And that's what we're about. And we're doing it in a lot of really new ways now. We have a brand new member community online, which I'm becoming very involved with. I love the new book club, which I'm also more or less in charge of moderating. We're having a great time doing this stuff and looking forward to much more, especially as we struggle with the rest of the world to come out of the pandemic.
We're talking right now, listeners, at the end of March in 2023. And the Planetary Society actually has a couple of things that are coming up very soon. There's the Planetary Defense Conference in Vienna.
Yeah.
And Matt, I know you're on your way to that, and also the Asteroid Hunters IMAX. So, Matt, give us some more details about those two initiatives.
Oh, sure. I'm thrilled because I'll be involved with this. There's so much more we have going on. But as we speak, we're 2 days away from my leaving for Vienna, never been there, for this 4-day conference that happens every other year, brings in experts in planetary defense from all over the world. And the old saying is, why did the dinosaurs go extinct? Because they didn't have a space program. It's true. We know the big one is out there. We know the one with our name on it is out there, the one that could do to us what an earlier one did to the dinosaurs. And this is why planetary defense, the only preventable natural disaster, is one of our core initiatives at the Planetary Society. So we're a longtime sponsor of the Planetary Defense Conference with a lot of other organizations, including a portion of the UN. And we always participated in a big way. We usually have a public event there. The public event this time will come right after the screening of this new movie that you mentioned. It's an IMAX film called Asteroid Hunters, and it happens to star a whole bunch of people, most of whom have been on planetary radio, who have devoted their professional lives to learning more about asteroids and comets and the threat that they present to Earth. Great story. Back a few years during the Planetary Defense Conference, an asteroid, at that point, a meteor, exploded over Chernobyl in Russia. And it was like, oh my God, could this have been more serendipitous? Apologies about that for the people in Chernobyl, because there were a lot of injuries, well over 1,000 injuries in Chernobyl. Fortunately, no one killed, as this good-sized rock, but far from the biggest that we might ever experience, exploded in the skies over this city in Russia. But it was a tremendous stimulant, helping people to understand why planetary defense, learning how about these objects and how to deflect them, is such an important priority. It's only one of our major initiatives. We have the search for life and the search for extraterrestrial intelligence and just exploring our solar system. These are all really important to us, but planetary defense is the one that might someday save our lives.
Matt, you've probably received this question many times already, and it's really not fair, but I have to ask it. Looking back on your more than 20 years hosting Planetary Radio, what are some of your favorite episodes and why? It's like, who's your favorite kid? You can't
Of
really answer
course.
that. You can't answer that, but some come to mind, and we won't call them favorites. We'll just call them notable, maybe, or memorable.
God, I'll never be standing on the Academy Award stage, but I understand how they feel. It's like that fear. Oh my God, if I mention anyone, I'm going to be leaving out. Because a lot of it does come down to my favorite people to talk to. So I won't say a favorite, but I will mention some favorites. I have had the best time every time I have interviewed Rob Manning, who is now the chief engineer at the Jet Propulsion Lab. I have had the best time every time I've talked to Andy Weir, the author of 2 #1 bestsellers, The Martian and now Project Hail Mary, and in between there, a terrific book called Artemis. And so it was a great dream of mine before I shuffled off as a host of Planetary Radio, if not this mortal coil, to bring the two of them together. And that was a show we did late last year, and it was such a blast. It was as much fun as I was hoping it would be, because these guys, not only are they two of the most brilliant creative minds on the planet, maybe in the universe, they're just really flat out funny. They're just hilarious. And so it really was almost critical mass bringing the two of them together. There are so many people, though, just these great passionate leaders. Astronauts, man, I've tried to count how many astronauts I've met, and it's really tough. And it goes from the people like Fred Hayes on Apollo 13, and these guys who were picked during that period because they had the right stuff. And that's different from the younger astronauts going up to the International Space Station today and hoping to go to the moon and maybe beyond. It's a different mindset. And I like to talk about this because those guys, man, they were steely-eyed missile men. Basically, that was the term used by the Air Force to describe missile guys. They were test pilots. They're tough guys. No nonsense, for the most part. There were exceptions, Buzz Aldrin being one of them. The people now have the right stuff still, but they are just the nicest people in the world. It's just fun to hang out with them. And why is that? It's by design, because NASA and other space agencies realized if you're going to be living in very close quarters with maybe 3 or 5 other people for a long time in this little tiny space and you cannot step outside to enjoy the breeze, they better be really nice people. And so that makes them also really nice people to talk to down here on Earth. So a lot of astronauts would be on my list. I'm stretching this out, but to go through the other stuff, you mentioned Planetary Radio Live. There is nothing like getting up in front of a few thousand people in some cases. Like when we filled the biggest auditorium at Caltech, just a few days, less than a week after the end of the Cassini mission that spent over 10 years orbiting Saturn. What a brilliantly successful mission. And we followed it across the radio show, Planetary Radio, to get the leaders of that mission on stage and be part of a standing ovation from them from a standing room only audience in that big auditorium at Caltech. It almost brings me to tears now. We were there again when the InSight landed on Mars. As it landed, and people were going crazy and hugging each other. We do this at Planet Fest when things land on Mars in the past. 2017, being on stage at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, Illinois, in front of something like 16,000 people, being the MC for the total eclipse, which is going to happen again in just about 1 year. We have big plans at the Planetary Society, and I know they're planning it again at SIU Carbondale. And then the places I've been able to go. You mentioned up front in your intro, going to the Atacama Desert in Chile and going up to 16,500 feet and about 5,000 meters and having to have a little can of oxygen that I would take a hit off of every few minutes and be up there in the ALMA array, this array of radio telescopes, or seeing a launch at Kennedy, watching our LightSail 2 launched on a Falcon Heavy rocket from the Kennedy Space Center a few years ago and putting this solar sail in space, which only just recently deorbited. We only just recently saw the end of that mission. I could go on, and I am.
Sure, of course.
So.
No, it's wonderful and so vivid. Matt, looking back at your 2 decades in the host chair, what are some of the lessons that you learned, really in any dimension, about science communication? Many of us are focused on that, wanting to make sure that this information, which can be abstract and it can be so complex, how to make it engaging, how to make it so vivid, and the imagery and things that you are such an expert in.
One of the nicest things I've heard from our audience over many years is when somebody will say, boy, I didn't quite understand everything they talked about. Maybe it was one of our more esoteric topic shows, but I sure loved listening to these people and the passion that they have for what they do. Now, that's not an excuse for not explaining things in a way that people can understand. We've sometimes done it on 2 levels in Planetary Radio, at least since we started the podcast. Because for the podcast, we've assumed that we have a somewhat more sophisticated audience than we have on average for the radio show. Because the radio show, we are still aired by something over 100 public radio stations. You never know who's going to tune in. And it could be that they just were listening to the show before that had nothing to do with science or space, and they stick around to see what's going on. Very possibly not as scientifically literate an audience as we get for the podcast, where people are listening very intentionally. So when we edit down from the podcast to the radio show, we try, I think Sarah, my wonderful successor, we try to pick out the portions of the conversation which not only communicate the more basic, more approachable, more understandable portions of a topic that we cover, but also those that best express the passion. Because For me anyway, communicating the science is no more important than communicating about the people who are conducting that science, showing that these people are as passionate as anyone else might be about their work and what they're discovering. I love Walt Whitman, and he wrote a great poem about the learned astronomer and how the learned astronomer whose lecture he went to talked about this and that about the moon and how far it is and how big the solar system is and so on and so forth. But there was no passion in it, no love. And so Walt goes outside and he just is overwhelmed by the romance of the sky. Walt, you were dead wrong because there no great scientist ever, and I'm going right up to Albert Einstein, has not felt that passion. Because if they don't feel it, they don't go into this business. It's too hard and it doesn't pay well enough if you don't feel that passion for what you want to do in almost all cases. So bringing that out is as important to me as explaining the science. Letting people express there it is again, the PB&J, the passion, beauty, and joy that they find in their work. The science itself, it's as simple sometimes as they're going to bring up a term, a little bit of jargon, and you have to be the one who catches that and say, hey, you mentioned this a moment ago. What does that acronym stand for? You probably know or not, but it needs to be brought out. Or maybe there's some concept which you just, maybe an analogy or a metaphor occurs to you. And that's a great way to bring it up with that person. And they might say, I'm going to use that from now on. That's also one of my proudest moments when I've had a metaphor and they say, oh, do you mind if I steal that? Because there's so much more that you can do that way. But it's an ongoing battle. And sometimes I have gotten carried away, technophile that I am, and probably not brought it down to the level that I should for the audience. And for that, I should have my wrist slapped.
Matt, you provided such an inspiring, engaging interview here, conversation, and I have not stopped smiling throughout the entire interview just
Well, me too.
because that is such a big part of engagement is that energy that the speaker has. And clearly you have it, you've had it throughout your entire career, and that wonder that you convey in your voice, it can do nothing but inspire and excite listeners. So thank you for sharing that with us during the interview here.
Thank you, Mark. And let me just say, we do indirectly deal with science communication on Planetary Radio and helping to communicate it better, but that you have this podcast, which is so devoted to this and related topics, is so important and more important in our society today. We have never before needed more science literate public. And it is largely up to scientists as well as journalists to make sure that we achieve that. So thank you for what you do.
Matt, thanks. And those will be the last words of our episode today. Just wonderful. We're going to have links to all of these resources and events and to Planetary Radio, Planetary Society, so our listeners can follow up and continue on this journey that is just so exciting. Thank you, listeners, for being here on this episode of When Science Speaks. And I hope you will be back next time for the next episode of When Science Speaks.
God, that was great.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to click subscribe. Check us out on the web at whensciencespeaks.com, and we'll see you next time.